Apparently, there was a recent shooting in Georgia of an African American running down the street by a former police officer. There was some conflict of interest in that case, so several people stepped out of handling the procedure of that. The individual African American was named Arbery. That primed me to want to read a Plus One article. This is a Plus One article as of 2018. It's another research article. It's called Primed for Death: Law Enforcement Citizen Homicides, Social Media, and Retaliatory Violence. Plus One, 2018, Volume 13, Part 1. The DOI is E019057-1. Primed for Death: Law Enforcement Citizen Homicides, Social Media, and Retaliatory Violence. Authors, researchers are Vladimir Behan, Conceptualization, Formal Analysis, Methodology. The writing was an original draft. The writing, the review and editing, Matthew Hickman. Conceptualization, writing, original draft, writing, review and editing, and Veronica F. Pozo. Conceptualization, formal analysis, methodology, writing, original draft, writing, review, and editing. This is from the Public Library of Science, another research article. I think this is fitting for the times. The abstract: we'll examine whether retaliatory violence exists between law enforcement and citizens while controlling for any social media contagion effect related to prior fatal encounters. Analyzed using trivariate dynamic structural vector autoaggressive model, daily time series data over a 21-month period captured the frequencies of police killed in the line of duty, police deadly use of force incidents, and social media coverage. The results support a significant retaliatory violence effect against minorities by police. There is no evidence of retaliatory violence against law enforcement officers by minorities. Also, social media coverage of Black Lives Matter movement increases the risk of fatal victimization to both law enforcement officers and minorities. Possible explanations for these results are based in rational choice and terror management theories. Introduction. Fatal interactions between police and the public became the subject of increased scrutiny following the 2014 shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, and several subsequent controversial police shootings. These fatal interactions are objectively rare in the context of all contacts between police and communities they serve, but they can evoke strong emotional reactions from the public. They are typically complex and dynamic events. The details are slow to emerge, and to the public, the legal structure and process surrounding the events are confusing, if not frustrating. Police use of deadly force is perhaps the most powerful expression of state authority, and it can be equally powerful in undermining the public perception of police legitimacy. The Black Lives Matter (BLM) movement, which emerged after the shooting of Trayvon Martin by Florida resident George Zimmerman, has seen an increased profile since the shooting of Michael Brown and related public demonstrations and riots. The developing narrative reflects a belief that police officers are more likely to kill minorities, all else being equal, and that the law insulates law enforcement from accountability. As a movement, there is little evidence that BLM supporters endorse retaliatory violence against the police. However, several police leaders have publicly expressed their opinion that BLM clearly does not endorse such violence. This narrative includes claims that the police are under attack and there is a war on cops. The killing of 5 Davis police officers in 2016 is a particularly troubling touch point in this regard. There has been debate over the nature of the threat. It can be said that a number of shootings of police during 2016 has exceeded the number recorded in 2015. Conservative political commentator Heather McDonald is often credited with articulating the Ferguson effect hypothesis, asserting that police officers respond to their fears of increased scrutiny by engaging in less proactive policing, leading to increased crime. The hypothesis has been extended to encompass a more general hesitancy to act, leading to decreased officer safety, as well as increases in retaliatory lethal attacks on police to avenge what are seen as racially motivated killings of blacks. One anecdotal example of this phenomenon was the stated refusal of a Chicago police officer to draw her weapon while being beaten because she feared the media coverage if she shot and killed her assailant, who was an African American male. This situation has led several scholars to investigate whether there are changes in proactive policing reflected in increased crime, the debate whether violence by or toward the police has increased, decreased, or stayed the same in the wake of these events. Recent research has examined whether there was a detectable increase in the killings of police post-Ferguson through March 2016 and found no evidence to support the hypothesis. While it is important to assess the effects of Ferguson and BLM as a historical turning point in perceptions of police legitimacy, as well as subsequent police and public behavior, the broader and arguably more important question that this research addresses is the general process question: whether the taking of a life by law enforcement is associated with retaliatory, lethal violence against law enforcement, and whether the reverse may also be true, that lethal violence against law enforcement is associated with increased killings by police. In fact, signals of perceived culpability for this violence and who is responsible can be found in other areas of our criminal justice system. In the courts, representatives of the law enforcement community have sued the Black Lives Matter movement and other organizations, claiming they are responsible for violence against officers. In one instance, the father of a Dallas police officer killed in an ambush by an offender specifically targeting law enforcement sued the Black Lives Matter movement and others who the complainant argues have convinced their supporters that there is a civil war between blacks and law enforcement, thereby calling for immediate violence and severe bodily injury or death. A similar suit claims Black Lives Matter leaders incite others to harm police in retaliation for the death of black men killed by the police. Quote unquote. The United States has a long history and tradition of local control over law enforcement. This is manifested in nearly 18,000 state and local enforcement agencies that operate outside of any unified command and control structure. As such, the best way to model public and law enforcement knowledge of lethal interactions, a prerequisite to retaliatory violence, is through media coverage. Over the last 2 years, the media in general, and social media in particular, have been increasingly used to inform the public of violence between law enforcement and the public. In a more recent editorial, Heather McDonald quotes New York Police Officer Commissioner James O'Neill as stating that a suspect who killed a police officer, hated by the police because he had heard and read countless times in conversation on television and in the newspapers the cops were killing the bad guys. This reference to the perceived power of the media, and given the rise of social media and its centrality to organizing movements such as BLM, demonstrates why it is important to assess the role of media, if any, in these fatal interactions. This research examines these relationships and seeks to answer the questions of whether there is any evidence of retaliatory violence between the two groups of victims, and to what extent social media plays a role in inciting these acts of violence. Fatal law enforcement and civilian encounters. Research focused on police shootings and criminal homicide is limited. A literature search yielded about a dozen published studies that have empirically assessed this relationship since 1970. A significant problem that persists to the present day is the lack of adequate data about police shootings. While the government has invested in collecting detailed information about officers killed in the line of duty, there has been less investment in collecting data on police use of force and justifiable and non-justifiable homicides by police. This has led to recent data collection efforts by media organizations such as The Guardian and The Washington Post, as well as crowdsourced efforts such as www.killedbypolice.net to enumerate individuals killed by law enforcement. The utility of these data collection efforts is demonstrated by the Justice Department's recent reliance on them to improve the validity and reliability of their own data. The earliest reported U.S. studies relied on whether vital statistics data or administrative data for either a single agency or a small collection of agencies, and typically used cross-sectional designs and bivariate analytic methods. See 10 through 15. These early studies were fairly consistent in finding a relationship between police shootings and criminal homicide, but were unable to draw conclusions about the direction of the relationship, which influenced which. The first reported longitudinal analysis conducted in 1986 using NYPD data concluded that the bivariate relationships reported in the literature were likely spurious. In the early 1990s, researchers turned their attention toward the FBI's Supplemental Homicide Reports, SHR, and subsequent research has consistently reported finding a relationship between various measures of community violence and police shootings. See 17 through 20. One longitudinal study conducted in 2001 using SHR data reported a temporal relationship between predatory homicides and police shootings at the national level. 21. However, it is important to note that the time series analysis used to model the relationships implicitly assumes that there is no feedback between variables. Specifically, it models police shootings as a function of predatory homicides, ignoring the fact that police homicides can, in turn, impact levels of predatory homicide. This is an inherent problem with this type of time series analysis and in most instances represents a misspecification of the model. 22. In sum, the current state of knowledge about the temporal relationship between police shootings and criminal homicide is extremely limited. While there is evidence of a bivariate relationship between violence and police shootings across time, location, levels of analysis, data sources, analytic methods, and theoretical frameworks, absent from the literature is a longitudinal study that accounts for the cyclic relationship between the variables under study as well as competing explanatory variables, such as media coverage as contagion. Social media as contagion. There is evidence that the media can act as a contagion, not only spreading ideas and information, but also emotions. For this study, we reasoned that for there to be retaliatory violence, citizens and law enforcement must be aware of the initial acts of violence. If a minority citizen is shot and killed by police and there is no media coverage of the event, it is difficult to argue that the killing of a law enforcement officer a day or a week later is driven by the prior fatal encounter. It is therefore important to understand how social media coverage of such events might communicate information about deadly encounters across social networks. Both traditional and social media can act as an emotional contagion, spreading fear, anger, and other negative effects in addition to pure information. Social media has been shown to directly impact the emotions of those consuming it. For example, looking at the social media activity of millions of Facebook users, it has been demonstrated that rain decreased the frequency of posts with positive connotation while increasing those with negative connotation. Just rain. Importantly, the researchers also found that an increase in users' negative posts significantly decreased the frequency of positive posts by individuals within their social networks, even though those friends were not physically located in areas with inclement weather. So it affected the friends of the friends and their posts as well. An experimental study that manipulated the Facebook content provided to hundreds of thousands of users found that reducing the number of positive posts to which users were exposed significantly decreased the frequency of positive words they used in subsequent posts, and a similar effect was found for decreasing posts with negative connotation, leading to the use of fewer negative words. So people kind of adjust to what they're seeing and hearing and feeling. They also produce more or less positive or negative words because of that adjustment. These studies provide empirical support that a person's emotional state and subsequently how they express themselves can be directly impacted by their social media networks. In addition, research has demonstrated that tweets with a negative or positive sentiment are retweeted more often and faster than tweets with a neutral message. For dry, clear eyes. This behavior could impact the breadth and speed of dissemination of social media messages related to fatal encounters between law enforcement and the public. This behavior could impact the breadth and speed of dissemination of social messages related to fatal encounters between law enforcement and the public. Due to the emotionally charged nature of BLM for supporters and non-supporters alike, one would expect that tweets referencing the movement would be anything but neutral in their content. This has implications for the contagion of social media and could explain why hashtag Black Lives Matter was one of the top hashtags used in 2015, a period that encompassed almost 2/3 of the time period under study for this research. This evidence of social media contagion and the spread of negative emotions is important when viewed through the lens of general strain theory, GST 27 through 30. From this perspective, fatal law enforcement citizens' encounters perceived as illegitimate are a source of strain, negative stimuli, generating negative emotions, primarily anger. Due to the particularly unjust nature and high magnitude of this strain as spread through social media, it is likely that these negative emotions will catalyze negative behaviors such as retaliatory aggression in order to reduce the strain. Individual traits and group pressures may also amplify the likelihood that this strain leads to retaliatory aggression. While tests of GST are somewhat mixed, there is ample support for these mechanisms. Although research on media effects has not specifically examined the relationship between social media and fatal law enforcement citizen encounters, it does provide evidence that social media coverage of these events could potentially increase the likelihood of future events. To further our understanding of the phenomena, we explore whether there is evidence that violence between law enforcement and the public is retaliatory in nature, and whether there is a media contagion effect that heightens the risk of further violence. Research, design, and measures. We use a structural vector autoregressive, that's SVAR model, to analyze the contemporaneous, cyclical, and dynamic relationships between variables. The SVAR model controls for temporal ordering and accounts for the relationship that these variables have on each other during the same day, for example, without a lag, i.e. without a lag. For additional background and technical detail on SVAR models, please see the supporting information section. Although the SVAR model is considered by some to facilitate drawing causal inferences from time series data, we caution readers that the strongest causal arguments are drawn from experimental methodologies, and therefore our results should be interpreted as association between variables, not causal relationships. Not a true experiment, not a causal relationship. For our analysis, we examined 4 variables across 2 models. I'll leave it at that for now, and then I'll go ahead and read the rest of research, design, and measures after this. I don't want to make these videos too long. Thank you.